The soft hum of conversation filled the ballroom, where David Carlyle stood at the center of attention. His name had just been announced as one of the most influential lawyers in Los Angeles. Applause echoed through the room as guests clinked their glasses in celebration of his latest courtroom victory. Yet, amidst the dazzling chandeliers and the sea of elegant gowns, one person seemed detached, Olivia Carlyle, his wife. She offered a polite smile when prompted, but kept glancing at her phone, her expression unreadable. As the evening drew on, David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. "Are you okay?" he asked Olivia softly as they made their way to the car. Her reply was curt, dismissive. "I'm just tired, David. It's been a long day." He didn't press further, attributing her mood to the long hours she'd been putting into her yoga sessions lately, yet her tone lacked the warmth he had once found so comforting. The drive back to their Brentwood mansion was quiet. David couldn't help but notice Olivia's hands fidgeting with her phone, her thumbs hovering over the screen as though she were debating whether to send a message. When they arrived home, she disappeared upstairs without a word. David lingered in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink, letting the unease sink in. He spotted her handbag left on the counter, a rare lapse in her usual meticulousness. Without fully knowing why, he reached inside. The receipt caught his eye immediately. It was from an upscale boutique downtown, detailing the purchase of a luxury watch, far beyond Olivia's usual spending habits. His brow furrowed as he read the date. Last Thursday. He distinctly remembered Olivia saying she was at her yoga class that evening. David placed the receipt back in the bag, his thoughts racing. Could it be a gift? But for whom? A friend, perhaps? He quickly brushed aside the thought, unwilling to entertain the darker possibilities. The next morning, Olivia's demeanor seemed unchanged, even cheerful, as she prepared to leave for another yoga session. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. David nodded, watching her leave, the unease from the previous night still clinging to him like a shadow. At work, David threw himself into his cases, hoping the routine would drown out his thoughts. But by lunchtime, he found himself scrolling through his phone, staring at the boutique's name on the receipt. His instinct as a lawyer kicked in, questions, timelines, inconsistencies. That evening, he decided to ask Olivia about it. The conversation was brief, her answers vague. "Oh, that? It's for Sarah," she said casually, referring to her closest friend. "Her birthday's coming up. I wanted to surprise her." David nodded, pretending to accept her explanation. But something about her tone felt rehearsed, calculated. Later that night, he texted Sarah asking about the gift. Her reply was immediate. "What gift?" David's heart sank as he stared at the message. The cracks in their marriage, once hidden beneath the surface, were beginning to show. The receipt, the vague explanations, and now this. Small things, yes, but they were beginning to form a larger, more troubling picture. That night, as Olivia slept soundly beside him, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind spiraling with questions he couldn't yet answer. David stared at the text on his phone, Sarah's words blurring before his eyes. "What gift?" The response hit him harder than he expected, like a quiet admission that something was truly wrong. He set the phone down on his desk, running a hand through his hair. For a man who thrived on facts and evidence in the courtroom, David now found himself in unfamiliar territory, his instincts as a lawyer clashing with his emotions as a husband. Over dinner that night, David tried to act normal, but every word Olivia said felt rehearsed, her laughter too light, too careful. She recounted her day at the yoga studio with what seemed like practiced ease. "We're planning a retreat next month," she mentioned, avoiding his gaze as she cut into her steak. "The instructor thinks it'll be good for our practice." David nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't press her, not yet, but his mind raced. The receipt, the text, the subtle shift in her demeanor over the past few months. Was it all connected, or was he seeing patterns where there were none? That night, while Olivia showered, David went into her handbag again. This time he found nothing out of the ordinary, but the absence of anything incriminating was in itself unsettling. She was careful, too careful. The following morning, David dropped Olivia off at the yoga studio on his way to work. As she stepped out of the car, he watched her through the rearview mirror. She hesitated at the door, glancing at her phone before stepping inside. It was a small moment, but it planted a deeper seed of doubt. He reached for his phone and made a decision. By noon, David was on the phone with a private investigator. "Amanda Lopez," she introduced herself, her voice crisp and professional. "How can I help you?" He hesitated for a moment before replying. "It's about my wife. I think she might be hiding something." Over the next few days, Amanda kept him updated on her progress. "She's been meeting someone," Amanda said during their first follow-up call. "A man, younger, athletic-looking. They've been spotted at a cafe near the studio and twice at a hotel downtown." David felt his stomach drop. The words were clinical, devoid of judgment, but they sliced through him like a knife. He struggled to focus on his work, his mind replaying Amanda's descriptions over and over. A man, younger, a hotel. That evening, Olivia returned home later than usual. She walked into the kitchen, kissed David on the cheek, and placed a takeout bag on the counter. "Thought you'd be hungry," she said with a smile. He forced himself to smile back, his chest tightening with every casual word she spoke. How could she act so normal? "Long day?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Yeah, the session ran late," she replied, unpacking the food. "Ryan, our instructor, wanted to go over some new techniques. You'd like him, you know. He's very inspiring." David's hand froze mid-motion. Ryan, a name. Suddenly, the man Amanda described had an identity, and the confirmation felt like a punch to the gut. "Sounds interesting," he managed, his voice betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "Maybe I'll meet him someday." The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but David's mind was far from calm. That night, after Olivia had fallen asleep, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Amanda's findings had given shape to his fears, but the worst part was yet to come. Confronting the reality of what this meant for their marriage, and for him. Amanda Lopez had worked on her fair share of infidelity cases, but something about David Carlisle's demeanor during their initial meeting had stayed with her. He wasn't just a husband looking for confirmation. He was a man unraveling under the weight of his own suspicions. His pain wasn't loud. It was quiet, restrained, but palpable. The first report came back within 48 hours. Amanda's voice was steady over the phone, but the words she spoke sent a chill down David's spine. "She's been meeting someone regularly," Amanda began. "He's younger, around 29, very fit, probably athletic or involved in physical training. They've been seen at a cafe near the yoga studio." David felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. "And?" he managed to ask, gripping the phone tighter. Amanda hesitated for a moment before continuing. "They've also met twice at a hotel downtown. No overnight stays, but the meetings were intimate." David didn't ask for more details. He simply hung up and stared blankly at the floor of his office. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier. Olivia's face flashed in his mind, her easy smile, her laughter over dinner, her casual mention of Ryan. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one he didn't want to see. That evening, Amanda delivered a manila envelope to David's home. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough to make out the figures. Olivia, seated across from a man at a small outdoor cafe, her expression animated, her body language relaxed. Another photo showed them walking into a hotel lobby, Olivia's hand brushing against his arm. David's heart sank as he flipped through the images. Each one felt like a dagger twisting deeper into his chest. When Olivia returned home that night, she found David in his study. The envelope lay open on his desk, the photographs spread out in front of him. "David?" she said cautiously, her eyes flicking to the desk before meeting his gaze. "What's going on?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit," he said, his tone colder than she had ever heard. She hesitated but complied. "Who is he?" David asked, his voice sharp yet trembling. Olivia's eyes widened briefly before she schooled her expression. "I don't know what you're talking about." David picked up one of the photographs and slid it across the desk. "This," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "This is what I'm talking about." Olivia stared at the image, her face pale. For a moment, neither of them spoke. the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Olivia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think, David." Her words were weak, unconvincing. David laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "Not what I think? Then enlighten me, Olivia. What exactly am I looking at?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. The excuses, the lies, none of them seemed adequate now. "I needed someone to talk to," she finally said, tears welling in her eyes. "Someone who listened." David stared at her, his jaw clenched. "And you couldn't talk to me?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "After everything, after all these years, you couldn't talk to me?" Olivia looked down, her silence louder than any explanation. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need air," he muttered, walking out of the room, leaving Olivia alone with the damning photographs and the weight of her choices. The silence in the house was oppressive, stretching long after David left Olivia in the study. He paced the patio outside, the cool night air doing little to ease the storm within him. Each image Amanda had provided burned in his mind, a reminder of how much he had missed, of how far Olivia had drifted without him realizing. His chest tightened as he considered his next move. That night, sleep eluded him. While Olivia lay curled in bed, her breathing steady and calm, David remained awake, staring at the ceiling. His instincts told him there was more she hadn't confessed, more she wasn't ready to admit. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them in silence. The next morning, David waited until Olivia had left for her yoga session. He knew she wouldn't return for hours, giving him enough time to search. It wasn't something he ever thought he would do, snooping through her personal belongings. But the betrayal had shifted his boundaries. He started in her closet, opening drawers and feeling through pockets, looking for anything that might confirm the truth. And then he found it, a small, locked box tucked beneath a stack of scarves. The lock was simple, almost decorative, and it only took him a moment to pry it open with a paperclip. Inside were letters, handwritten in a neat, flowing script. David's breath caught as he pulled out the first one. "Olivia, you're the most incredible woman I've ever met. When I'm with you, the world feels brighter, lighter. I don't want this to end, and I know you don't either. Let's stop pretending we can go back to the lives we had before. You deserve more. You deserve happiness. Ryan." The paper trembled in David's hands. He read another letter, then another. Each one painted a picture of a relationship far deeper than he'd imagined. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, intimate. Ryan wasn't a passing distraction. He was someone Olivia had allowed into the most private parts of her heart. As he read, a wave of nausea rolled over him. The words, so carefully chosen, spoke of promises, of plans, of a future. David's mind raced. Was she planning to leave him? Was Ryan urging her to end their marriage? His pulse quickened at the thought. David didn't stop at the letters. Beneath them, he found receipts, dinners at upscale restaurants, jewelry, and the spa retreat she had claimed was a gift for Sarah. The dates lined up with the times she had told him she was at yoga. Every lie Olivia had told, every carefully constructed excuse unraveled in his hands. When Olivia returned that afternoon, she found David waiting in the living room, the box of letters sitting on the coffee table between them. Her face froze, the color draining as she realized what he had found. "David," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," he interrupted, his tone icy. "I've had enough lies for one lifetime." He gestured to the letters. "So this is what you've been doing? Planning a life with him behind my back?" Olivia's hands shook as she sat down across from him. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far." David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "How far did it go, Olivia? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've already decided I'm not part of your future." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but David felt no sympathy. Not this time. "He made me feel alive," she admitted, her voice cracking. You stopped seeing me, David. You stopped caring." Her words were like fuel to the fire. "I stopped caring?" David repeated, his voice rising. "I worked every day to build this life for us, and you threw it away for... What? For someone who writes pretty words on paper?" Olivia broke down, her sobs filling the room. But David felt no relief, no satisfaction, only a deep, hollow ache as the weight of her betrayal pressed down on him. "Get out," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "I can't look at you right now." The tension had reached its breaking point. For days, David carried the weight of Olivia's betrayal, the damning photographs, and the heartfelt letters. He couldn't look at her without seeing the lies etched into every word she had spoken. But this morning was different. Amanda had called earlier with new information David wasn't sure he could ignore. "She's meeting him again today," Amanda had said. "A hotel downtown, room booked under a pseudonym, same as before." Her voice was calm, professional, but the implication was clear. David's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his desk. Enough was enough. By the time David arrived at the hotel, his heart was pounding, each step forward fueled by anger and resolve. The lobby was polished and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. Amanda had already confirmed the room number, and David's sharp eyes scanned the lounge until they landed on two familiar figures. There they were. Olivia sat across from Ryan Mitchell, her posture relaxed, a faint smile playing on her lips. Ryan leaned in, saying something that made her laugh softly. The sight ignited something primal in David, a mix of hurt and fury that threatened to consume him. "Olivia!" His voice cut through the quiet hum of the room like a knife. Heads turned as the name echoed, curiosity and confusion rippling through the space. Olivia froze, her eyes wide as she slowly turned to see David standing just a few feet away. "David!" she began, her voice barely audible, but he didn't let her finish. "Don't!" he snapped, his voice trembling with emotion. "Don't you dare say my name like that!" His gaze shifted to Ryan, who had straightened in his seat, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. Ryan stood, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Mr. Carlyle, I think you need to calm down," he said, his tone careful but condescending. David took a step closer, his hands clenching into fists. "Calm down?" he echoed, his voice rising. "You think I'm going to calm down while you sit here with my wife like it's nothing?" "David, please," Olivia interjected, standing now, her voice pleading. "Let's not do this here." David's eyes snapped to hers, his pain evident in every word. "Why not, Olivia? Afraid the truth might embarrass you? Afraid people might see who you really are?" The murmurs around them grew louder as more onlookers took notice of the scene unfolding. David didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see. "David, this isn't fair," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice dripping with bitterness. "I understand that while I was working to give you the life you wanted, you were sneaking around with him." He pointed at Ryan, whose jaw tightened as he met David's glare. "Look, man," Ryan started, his voice more assertive now. "You're upset, and I get it. But this isn't the place for—" "Upset?" David barked, taking another step forward. "You think this is just about me being upset? You've been sleeping with my wife, and you have the audacity to tell me how I should feel?" Hotel security began to approach, their radios crackling, but David's focus never wavered. Olivia stepped between the two men, her hands raised as if to stop an inevitable explosion. "David, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Let's go somewhere private and talk." But David shook his head, his voice breaking. "I have nothing left to say to you, Olivia. Nothing." He turned and stormed out of the hotel, leaving Olivia standing there, shattered and exposed. Ryan reached for her arm, but she pulled away, her tears falling freely as the weight of her choices bore down on her. The eyes of strangers followed David as he walked out onto the busy street, the noise of the city drowning out the chaos in his mind. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do next, but one thing was certain: there was no going back now. The tension in the Carlyle household was palpable. David and Olivia had barely exchanged words since the hotel incident, their arguments now replaced by a strained, deafening silence. The only sounds were the occasional clink of dishes or the creak of footsteps echoing through the grand halls. Sophie Carlyle, their 17-year-old daughter, noticed the shift immediately. At first, she chalked it up to the usual stresses of her father's demanding career. But as days turned into weeks, the atmosphere grew heavier, colder, and Sophie couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just work. Something deeper was unraveling her family, and no one was talking about it. One evening, as Sophie sat at the dining table doing homework, David walked past her, his face etched with exhaustion. "Dad?" she called out hesitantly. He stopped but didn't turn to face her. "Yeah?" he replied, his voice distant. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face for a hint of reassurance. David turned to her then, his expression softening. "It's fine, sweetheart, just work stuff." But Sophie knew better. His forced smile only deepened her unease. Later that night, Sophie overheard muffled voices from her parents' room. She crept closer, her heart racing as she strained to make out the words. "You've destroyed this family, Olivia." David's voice was sharp, filled with a pain Sophie had never heard before. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Olivia's reply was quieter but no less emotional. "I didn't mean for it to happen, David. I was lonely. You were never here. And that's your excuse?" David interrupted, his tone bitter. "You didn't even think about Sophie. What do you think this will do to her?" Sophie's breath hitched, her stomach twisting. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. What had her mother done? What could be so terrible that it made her father speak with such anger, such heartbreak? The next morning, Sophie decided she couldn't stay in the dark any longer. As her mother prepared breakfast in the kitchen, Sophie stood at the doorway, her arms crossed. "Mom, what's going on with you and Dad?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with fear. Olivia froze, the spatula in her hand hovering over the pan. "Nothing, honey. Your dad and we're just going through a rough patch," she said, forcing a smile. "Don't lie to me," Sophie shot back, her voice cracking. "I heard you last night. I heard him say you destroyed this family. What did he mean by that?" Olivia turned to face her daughter, her eyes filled with tears. "Sophie, I made a mistake," she began, her voice trembling. "A mistake I can't take back." Sophie's chest tightened as her worst fears began to materialize. "What kind of mistake?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What did you do?" Before Olivia could answer, David entered the kitchen. His presence was commanding, his face hard. "She doesn't need to hear this," he said firmly, his gaze fixed on Olivia. "Yes, I do," Sophie interjected, stepping between them. "I deserve to know what's happening to my family." David hesitated, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation bore down on him. "Your mother," he paused, his voice faltering. "Your mother was seeing someone else." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, each syllable hitting Sophie like a blow. Her legs felt weak, her vision blurred with tears. "What?" she whispered, barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Olivia said, stepping closer to her daughter. "I love you, Sophie. Please, understand." "Understand?" Sophie's voice cracked as she pulled away. "You want me to understand how you could do this to Dad? To us? I don't even know who you are anymore." Her words cut through Olivia like a blade, but Sophie didn't stop. "You broke us," she said, her voice trembling. "You broke everything." Without another word, Sophie ran upstairs, slamming her door shut. Alone in her room, she collapsed onto her bed, sobs racking her body as the weight of her mother's betrayal settled in. Downstairs, Olivia sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands, while David stood silently by the doorway, his expression blank. David sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn tightly shut. The once pristine space, lined with plaques and framed degrees, now felt claustrophobic. His phone vibrated on the desk, its screen lighting up with another notification. The headlines had started that morning, and by now the story was everywhere. Prominent lawyer's marriage in shambles, affair exposed. David Carlisle's wife caught in scandal with younger man. High-profile infidelity rocks Brentwood. David didn't need to open the articles to know the contents. Amanda had warned him that the photographs would eventually leak, but the reality of seeing his private life splashed across every tabloid felt like a blow to the chest. He hadn't even left his house that morning, unwilling to face the inevitable whispers and stares. The door to his office creaked open. Sophie stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Dad, everyone at school knows." Her voice cracked and she gripped the doorframe for support. "They're sending me screenshots, making jokes." Her lips trembled. "I can't go back there." David's heart broke at the sight of her. He stood and crossed the room, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I never wanted you to go through this. But they're saying things about you too," Sophie continued, her words muffled against his chest. "About Mom. And that man. It's all over the internet." David didn't have an answer. What could he say? That it would pass? That people would forget? Even he knew those were lies. Releasing Sophie, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he promised. "Together." But Sophie didn't look convinced. Downstairs, Olivia sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television that wasn't even turned on. Her phone buzzed endlessly on the coffee table, each notification another reminder of how far-reaching the scandal had become. She didn't dare pick it up. The sound of David's footsteps descending the stairs made her flinch. When he entered the room, his expression was unreadable, a stark contrast to the raw anger she had faced before. "You need to handle this," he said simply, his voice cold. "Because it's not just about you anymore. Sophie's being dragged into this." Olivia nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't want this to happen," she whispered. "I didn't want any of this." David shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Wanting doesn't matter, Olivia. Choices do, and your choices have consequences. For all of us." The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell ringing. Olivia stiffened, but David moved to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was Emily Warren, a journalist from one of the city's most notorious tabloids. Her notepad was already in hand, her expression eager. "Mr. Carlyle," she began, her tone smooth but insincere. "Do you have a comment on the recent allegations about your wife's affair?" David's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Leave," he said through gritted teeth. "Mr. Carlyle, the public deserves to know your side of the story," Emily pressed. "How does this affect your legal career, your family's image?" David stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "If you don't leave now, I'll make sure you regret ever showing up here." Emily took a cautious step back, her smirk fading. "This isn't going away, Mr. Carlyle," she said before turning on her heel. David slammed the door shut, his hands trembling with rage. When he returned to the living room, Olivia was wiping her tears. "What did they want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To exploit our pain," David replied, his tone flat. "Like everyone else." That evening, David sat at the dining table with Sophie. They ate in silence, the weight of the day pressing heavily on them both. Olivia stayed upstairs, unable to face them. As Sophie pushed her food around her plate, she finally spoke. "Do you think it'll ever go back to normal?" she asked softly. David looked at her, his expression weary. "I don't know, Sophie," he admitted. "I really don't." The Carlyle house was steeped in tension that refused to dissipate. Olivia had retreated further into herself, avoiding both David and Sophie. Meanwhile, David's resolve hardened. He couldn't afford to be passive anymore, not after everything that had already been exposed. But what Amanda revealed next would shake him to his core. Late one evening, Amanda called. Her voice was calm, but there was a weight to her tone. "David," she began, "I found something unusual." David sat forward in his chair, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Unusual how?" he asked, his mind already bracing for another blow. "It's about Olivia's finances," Amanda explained. "There's a pattern of withdrawals from her personal account. Large amounts transferred to an account under Ryan Mitchell's name. It totals over $50,000 across the past 6 months. David's breath caught, his pulse quickening. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "Yes," Amanda replied. "I've got the documentation to prove it." The room seemed to tilt around David as he processed her words. $50,000? While he had been working tirelessly to maintain their lifestyle, Olivia had been siphoning money to Ryan. The betrayal was no longer just emotional, it was financial, and it cut deeper than he thought possible. The next morning, David waited for Olivia in the kitchen. She entered hesitantly, her eyes darting toward him as though she sensed what was coming. "We need to talk," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "David, I'm not in the mood for another fight," Olivia began, but he interrupted her. $50,000, Olivia, he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Care to explain why our money is sitting in Ryan Mitchell's account?" Her face blanched, her hand gripping the counter for support. How do you know about that? She stammered. That doesn't matter, David snapped, his patience wearing thin. What matters is that you've been funneling money to him while pretending this was just some emotional mistake. So tell me the truth. Was this about love? Or was he just using you? Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but her words came out defensive. He needed help, David. His yoga studio was struggling and he didn't have anyone else to turn to. David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Help? Is that what you're calling it? This wasn't help, Olivia. This was funding an affair. It wasn't like that, she cried, her voice breaking. He cared about me. He wasn't just after my money. David slammed his hand on the counter, his anger finally boiling over. Do you even hear yourself? You've been lying to me, to Sophie, and now you're defending him? The man who's been draining our resources while destroying our family? Olivia's tears flowed freely now. But David couldn't find it in himself to comfort her. The image of Ryan laughing with her at the hotel, enjoying dinners paid for with David's hard-earned money, was too much to bear. As their argument grew louder, Sophie appeared in the doorway, her face pale. What's going on now? She demanded, her voice trembling. More secrets? More lies? David turned to her, his anger softening into guilt. Sophie, this isn't about you, he said, his tone gentler. This is between your mother and me. But Sophie wasn't convinced. Everything's about me now, she shouted, her voice cracking. I have to live with what everyone's saying about us, about her. And you're telling me it's even worse than I thought? Olivia reached out to her daughter, but Sophie pulled away, her face twisted with anger and hurt. I can't do this anymore, she said before running upstairs, slamming her door behind her. The house fell silent again, the weight of the confrontation settling over them like a heavy fog. David stared at Olivia, his eyes filled with disappointment. This isn't just about us anymore, he said quietly. You've dragged everyone into this mess, and I don't know how we're supposed to come back from it. Olivia didn't respond. She simply sat down at the kitchen table, burying her face in her hands, as the enormity of her actions finally hit her. David left the room, his footsteps heavy as he retreated to his office, already planning his next move. David hadn't been able to shake the feeling that there was more to Ryan Mitchell than met the eye. Something about the calculated way he'd insinuated himself into Olivia's life, first as her yoga instructor, then as a confidant, and finally as a lover, felt orchestrated. Amanda Lopez, the private investigator, had unearthed the financial betrayal, but David suspected Ryan's motives ran deeper than mere opportunism. His suspicions were confirmed during Amanda's latest update. David, Amanda said, her tone serious, I've done some digging into Ryan's past, and it's worse than we thought. David leaned forward in his chair, gripping the phone tightly. What do you mean? Amanda paused, choosing her words carefully. Ryan has a history of targeting wealthy women. I found court records from 2 years ago, a civil suit filed by another woman claiming he coerced her into funding his failed business ventures. The case was settled quietly, but the pattern is there. David's stomach churned. How many women? He asked, his voice low. 3, Amanda replied. That we know of. The revelation hit David like a freight train. Ryan wasn't just some young man caught up in an affair. He was a predator, deliberately exploiting vulnerable women for personal gain. And Olivia had been his latest victim. That evening, David confronted Olivia again. She was seated at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. The lines on her face seemed deeper, her shoulders slumped under the weight of everything that had come to light. Ryan isn't who you think he is, David said, his voice sharp but controlled. Olivia looked up, her expression wary. What are you talking about? David placed a stack of papers on the table. Court records, testimonies, financial statements. He's done this before, Olivia. Targeted women like you. Wealthy, lonely, looking for someone to fill a void. He didn't care about you. He cared about what you could give him. Olivia's face drained of color as she flipped through the documents. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're wrong. Ryan isn't like that. Isn't he? David shot back, his voice rising. Then explain why he's taken $50,000 from you. Explain why he's lied to you, manipulated you, and used you like a damn bank account. Tears spilled down Olivia's cheeks as the truth began to sink in. "I thought he cared about me," she said, her voice trembling. I thought he loved me." David's expression softened slightly, though his anger still simmered beneath the surface. "Maybe he did, in his own twisted way," he said. "But love doesn't do this. Love doesn't drain you dry and leave you to deal with the fallout." Olivia buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. For the first time, David saw not just a betrayer, but a broken woman who had been played as much as he had. It didn't absolve her, but it made her human. The next day, David met Amanda in person to discuss their next steps. "He needs to be held accountable," David said firmly. "Not just for what he's done to my family, but for every woman he's hurt." Amanda nodded. "I've already contacted the other women. They're willing to talk. If we can build a strong enough case, we might be able to take him down." As the pieces began to fall into place, David felt a strange sense of clarity. For months, his life had been consumed by betrayal, anger, and doubt. But now, with the truth exposed and a plan in motion, he finally felt a semblance of control. Ryan might have taken much from him, but David was determined to take something back. Justice. That evening, as he sat alone in the living room, David received a call from one of the other women Amanda had mentioned. Her voice was hesitant but filled with determination. "Mr. Carlyle," she said, "I don't know if this will help, but Ryan recorded everything. Videos, photos. He threatened to use them against me if I didn't give him money." David's blood ran cold. "Did he ever use them?" he asked. "No," the woman replied, her voice shaking. "But he might still have them." David hung up, his mind racing. Ryan hadn't just exploited Olivia financially. He might have leveraged far darker tactics to maintain his control. The stakes had just been raised, and David knew this was far from over. The courtroom was a stark, somber space, its walls lined with muted wood paneling that seemed to absorb the tension in the air. David sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression steely, his eyes fixed on the opposing side. Olivia was seated with her attorney, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The buzz of whispers in the gallery quieted as the judge entered, her gavel striking once to bring the room to order. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the proceedings began. David had spent the past few weeks preparing for this moment. With Amanda Lopez's help, he had compiled a damning case against Ryan Mitchell, not just for his actions toward Olivia, but for the pattern of manipulation and exploitation that had harmed multiple women. Today wasn't just about their divorce. It was about exposing the truth. The first witness called to the stand was Amanda. She spoke with precision, detailing her findings about Ryan's history and his use of financial and emotional coercion to prey on wealthy women. "The evidence is consistent," she testified. "Mr. Mitchell targeted Mrs. Carlyle, gaining her trust before exploiting her financially. This pattern has been documented in at least 3 other cases." Ryan, seated at the back of the courtroom, smirked as if unimpressed. David's jaw tightened at the sight, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table. When it was Olivia's turn to testify, the room grew heavy with anticipation. She rose slowly, her movements hesitant, and took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted how she had met Ryan, how their relationship had developed, and how she had allowed herself to be manipulated. "I thought he cared about me," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But now I see. I was just another target." Her admission was met with murmurs in the gallery, a mix of sympathy and judgment rippling through the crowd. David watched her closely, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, pity, and sadness. The turning point came when one of Ryan's previous victims was called to testify. A woman named Julia stepped forward, her demeanor confident but tinged with weariness. She described how Ryan had lured her into a similar web of lies, using her resources to prop up his failing ventures while threatening her with intimate photos and videos when she tried to break away. "He's a master manipulator," Julia said, her voice firm. "He knows exactly what to say, what to promise, to make you believe he's genuine. But it's all a lie." Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Ryan shifted in his seat, his smug expression faltering for the first time. David's attorney seized the moment, presenting financial records, text messages, and other evidence that painted a clear picture of Ryan's schemes. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow, shattering any defense Ryan might have prepared. When it was Ryan's turn to speak, he rose with a casual air, his charm on full display. "This is all just a misunderstanding," he began, his smile practiced. "Yes, I had relationships with these women, but they were consensual. They knew exactly what they were getting into. But his confidence was his downfall. Under cross-examination, his lies unraveled. Questions about his financial inconsistencies and threatening messages left him stammering, his charm no longer enough to shield him. The judge's gavel struck again, silencing the room. "I have reviewed the evidence," she said, her tone grave, "and it is clear that Mr. Mitchell engaged in a deliberate pattern of deceit and financial exploitation. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff." Relief washed over David as the verdict was announced, but it was bittersweet. Though justice had been served, the damage to his family could not be undone. As the courtroom emptied, Olivia approached him cautiously. "David," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret, "I'm so sorry for everything." David looked at her, his face unreadable. "We all made mistakes," he replied. "But some mistakes are harder to forgive than others." The house was quieter than it had ever been. The once bustling mansion in Brentwood now felt cavernous, each empty room a testament to what had been lost. David sat in the living room, the early morning light streaming through the windows. His suitcases sat by the front door, a silent acknowledgement that this chapter of his life was over. The court's ruling against Ryan Mitchell had been a victory, but it felt hollow. Justice had been served, but the damage to his family was irreparable. Olivia had moved out 2 weeks ago, retreating to a smaller home on the other side of the city. Sophie had chosen to stay with David, though her once bright demeanor was now clouded with a guarded sadness. "Dad?" Sophie's voice broke the silence. She appeared in the doorway, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her face still carrying the weariness of the past months. "Are you okay?" David gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, kiddo, just thinking." Sophie hesitated, then walked over and sat beside him. "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" she asked softly, her gaze fixed on the floor. David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Normal's going to look different now," he admitted, "but we'll find our way, one day at a time." Sophie nodded, though her expression remained somber. I miss how it used to be," she confessed, "before all of this." David didn't have an answer. He missed it too. The life they had before betrayal tore it apart. But he knew there was no going back, only forward. Later that day, David visited the office of Amanda Lopez to thank her personally for everything she'd done. "You didn't just uncover the truth," he told her, his voice sincere. "You helped me find clarity. I'll always be grateful for that." Amanda nodded, her expression professional yet kind. "Closure is a difficult thing," she replied. "But you fought for your family. That says a lot." As David left her office, he felt a sense of resolution beginning to take root. There was no undoing the past, but perhaps there was hope for the future. Back at the house, David found a letter waiting for him. It was from Olivia, her handwriting familiar yet somehow foreign. He hesitated before opening it, his heart heavy with mixed emotions. "David, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I don't know if I deserve it. But I need you to know how deeply sorry I am for everything. I let my loneliness and my own flaws destroy what we built together, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. Please take care of Sophie. She needs you more than ever, and I know you'll be the father she deserves." Olivia David folded the letter carefully, placing it on the table. He didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but he felt a small weight lift, knowing she understood the consequences of her actions. That evening, David and Sophie shared dinner in the kitchen, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in weeks. They talked about her school projects, her friends, even her plans for the upcoming summer. For the first time in months, there was laughter, soft, hesitant, but real. As Sophie cleared the dishes, David stood by the window looking out at the backyard where they'd once hosted family barbecues and birthday parties. The memories were bittersweet, but they no longer felt like a burden. Instead, they were reminders of what had been and what could still be. "Hey, Dad," Sophie called from the sink. Maybe this summer we could go somewhere, just us." David turned to her, a genuine smile forming on his face. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that a lot." The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, David felt ready to face it. One day at a time, he thought again, and maybe, just maybe, they'd find something better waiting on the other side. What do you think of Olivia's actions in this story? Do you believe there is any hope for reconciliation, or is this the end of the road for her and David? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. From which region are you watching this video? We'd love to know. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more content like this.